Greetings and welcome to the Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. We hope that you enjoy what you're about to see, and you can find us on the corner of Broadway and Church Streets at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. Or you can find us at bgmethodist.org and on Facebook at Bowling Green First United Methodist Church.
So we're starting back on the history part of on the study of the Bible this morning, on the history section of the Bible. Let me get my words in the right order. But as we get started with that though this morning, I've got a really important question to ask you, and this is your chance to respond to that. And that is, what do you all know about the Wild West or the Old West? What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say Wild West?
The song.
Cowboys. The song. Yeah, the song and what? What else? Okay, Hurrah. I haven't heard that one yet today. That's a good one. Remember who it was this morning said something about John Wayne. I'm going, yeah, that's, he's kind of synonymous now with Westerns, and especially that whole genre of movies from back in the mid-1900s, the spaghetti Westerns that are so much fun to watch, but are a little bit different by our standards of movie making now. Anything else that just comes to mind as you think about that? What, the Gold Rush? That's a good one. That's a good one. Now, of all the things that come to mind when you are thinking about the Wild West and all of that, how much of that is actually verifiable historical fact? There'd be probably a good chunk of it, but how much more of that are the stories that have been told? The stories that we tell over and over and over again, because those are the stories they get remembered and they get passed down. There's a whole lot we know about the Wild West, but there's a whole lot more that is myth and legend and folklore even. And it's not just that period of time in our history, but there's other times in our history where we do that. Because if I asked you the question, what was it that George Washington chopped down? Cherry tree. What was Abraham Lincoln's nickname? Honest Abe. What did Johnny Appleseed do? Planted apple trees. Going back, outside of our history, going back a little bit farther, Robin Hood stole from the rich and gave to the poor. All sorts of stuff where some historians might kind of go back and they might start quibbling a little bit about the veracity of what it is we tell, the stories we tell, and all of that. But it doesn't diminish the power of those stories, though, does it? It doesn't make those any less important to us now than when they were first told. Because we remember, we tell them, we keep going on, they are a part of who we are. When the first chunk of history books in the Old Testament are a lot like that. They're a lot like the Old West of the Old Testament. This is kind of the end of Genesis, the first part of Exodus, and then the books of Joshua and Judges. Those are kind of where we have lots of these stories that are told, but there's not a whole lot of the stories that were written down. They were told from one generation to the next for a long time, because much like out in the Old West, it's really hard if you're being chased by someone on a horse behind you and you're on a horse in front of them trying to get away. The last thing you're worried about doing is trying to write down everything that's happening there. You just don't do that. But you might tell your kids or your friends or your grandkids that story later on down the road for whatever it was that was going on, what was happening, and you'll tell them that story. Because that could be an important story about who you are and what got you to where you are today. And that's what we see there in those books is a lot of that kind of history. It's not maybe necessarily always the most accurate as far as we're concerned for history books, but it's just as important to identifying who we are. And we see this with Joshua. You were talking to the kids earlier when they came up, and Joshua was taking over, and he was kind of beginning to lead Israel, and they were trying to figure out what do they do next. And so they get up here to, they start going around the walls of the city, making their way around the city of Jericho for 7 days, walking around until finally, I'm quiet. until finally they get to the seventh day, the trumpet blows, and they all start screaming and yelling and making noise, and then as the song goes, and the walls come tumbling down. That was an important story, not just for the people of Israel, but for Joshua. And it became an incredibly important story for the history of Israel that they would remember. And it's not so much because we don't know historically how accurate that is. That's really not the point. The point becomes, why did they continue to tell the story? Why was that so important to who they were? And we get to the end of this in Joshua's reading for this morning, and our reading out of Joshua for this morning, where Joshua is towards the end of his life. He's coming to the end of his days. He's giving those last words, those last commands, those last instructions, and he says this to the people. He says, hold on to the Lord your God instead, exactly as you've done right up to today. Be faithful. Stay faithful to God, because Joshua remembers. And the people of Israel remember, because we hear the sequence of events told time and time and time and time again as we go through the Old Testament. Joshua remembers saying, remember when we were brought out of Egypt. We were slaves, we were brought out. Remember we crossed the Red Sea, and then we wandered in the wilderness, and then we crossed over into the Promised Land, and then we went up against the fabled city of Jericho with its great big walls that no one could beat, and here we are, this army that is getting to be pretty good. It wasn't as good as it was going to get, but how are they going to take the city of Jericho? And yet they come up to the walls, and they were able to defeat them and to continue to go on. And Joshua says it's because we were faithful. We remembered where we were. We remembered who we were in the midst of all of this. And he tells them, don't forget that. Remember that peace. Remember that moment. When we go on from Joshua and Judges, we go into the next section of, if those are like the Wild West of our history books in the Old Testament, we move on to the more formal, the recorded history that we have in the Old Testament. This covers 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, and these are more like the histories that we expect to read, that we expect to know. And they're writing intentionally that way because they're even talking about, and remember, all these things were recorded in the book of the Kings. You'll see that kind of come back time and again as you read through those history books. Or they'll reference saying, wasn't this written down somewhere else? Wasn't this, they're making cross-references. They're trying to keep as accurate a portrayal as possible of the events that are taking place. Now, as you read through those, I'm going to have to say, if you all are like me, you're probably a little bit better about reading through the history books of the Old Testament than, say, maybe those books where Tom doesn't ever want me to give him one of those passages that's got all the names in there. You know those places that we skip over where you get to that first place and says, well, there's a name I don't know, there's a name I don't know. And there's the last name I don't know. Here's the name, do we skip all that stuff there in the middle? We don't skip over the history books so much, but when we read through them a little bit more quickly than we would in other places. But even then, you probably begin to notice that there are some similarities. If you look between 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they're covering the same time period. They're covering the same sets of events in a lot of times. But they're telling the story a little bit differently. It's a little bit different than what one will say, than what the other one will say, and it's not the same way that I know y'all in Louisiana are really close to one another, and you always experience everything exactly the same way, right? So if folks in Bowling Green tell a story one way, the folks over in Louisiana are going to tell it the exact same way, right? Yeah, probably not. You can tell that story a little bit differently. And both sides of the Bowling Green of Louisiana is going to say, well, the other side's telling it wrong. That's not how that went, right? Now, down in the southern part of the county, and I looked around at them and I said, and y'all down here in the southern part of the county are probably going to look up at them and say, no, you both are wrong. Here's how it really went. This is how things go. And that's part of our history, is that it depends on who's telling the story, as to how it gets told. And so that's part of it. When we begin to read through that, we've got to remember, who is it that's telling these stories? Who is it that's trying to record these things and write these things down, because we've got some different vantage points, and there are some different points of view that are telling the stories of these events. And we see that with Kings and with Chronicles. And then we might say we could go on to the prophets. The prophets really aren't history books. They're a whole own section of books, and we'll get to those in a couple of weeks. But we get to the kind of the time of the end of the prophets. You know, and quite literally for us in Protestant churches and the Methodist Church and other and folks who aren't Catholic, we get to the end of the prophets, we flip the page, we start the New Testament, and it's like, wait a minute, how did we get here? Because we go, but when we leave the prophets, you know, Israel has returned from exile. They're settled back now in the promised land that they had been exiled from. They're beginning to rebuild things. And Persia is the nation that's in charge, is the empire that's in charge of everything. You turn the page and all of a sudden Israel's not doing quite as well as they were, and the Romans are in charge. You go, wait a minute. It's like watching one of your favorite TV shows. You get up through so many episodes and you miss 2 or 3 weeks in the middle of it. You go back, you watch the next episode that comes on TV, and you go, how'd you get here? How'd you get to this point in the story? Like, I'm missing something in there. And that's what we are. We're missing, in our biblical accounts of Israel's history, we're missing a piece of that in the middle of there. Now, if your Bible says that it's got to be apocrypha with it, you've got a whole bunch more books, but you're also going to have some more history books in there, like 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and sometimes 4th Maccabees are going to be in there that tell some of the story of that missing history. I was telling Tom Owens earlier, he had that Bible, so I got that exact same Bible, except I got the apocrypha with it, and it added about another ½ inch to my Bible. If you want a good heavy book, that's the one to get. But yeah, that is. But for most of our Bibles, we don't have those pieces in there. We're missing that history. And that's the next thing that's hard about history, is that we're always going to be missing something. We aren't always going to have all the details there that we're going to need. There's always going to be something that's missing. And so we've got a couple of things we've got to watch for. First is who's telling the story, and then what things are missing that might be important to how we got to where we are. And so we have to be careful that as we read through the history books of the Old Testament especially. And so there are one don't and a couple of do's as we go through that. Oh, I'm still holding that. As we go through that, the don't is don't make one-to-one comparisons. Don't look at it and go, well, I'm reading this in the book of 1 Kings, and that looks an awful lot like what we're going through right now. And so these things must, maybe we should just do the same thing they did back then, and that's going to work out just fine. Probably not going to work out just fine. Because things are different, times are different, places are different. Now, making that one-to-one comparison is not going to work because, well, we don't know, we got to remember who's telling the story. We've got to remember what things are missing in there that we don't know about what was going on there that make that make sense for them in that time. But there are some things that we can do. Rather than trying to make that one-to-one comparison, we can learn from what happened then. We can learn those lessons, and then we can work to apply those lessons, just as Joshua was doing with the people of Israel at the end of the book that's named for him. When he was looking at them saying, remember the stories that you've told, remember the stories that we tell all the time, remember everything that has happened, remember, but most importantly, remember this lesson. Remember the lesson that we've got there that says, stay faithful to God. Stay faithful to God because God is there with us. Now, as folks are going to, maybe you've had this question come up before for you, or maybe you've had someone ask you this question before. Why is it that God seems so different from the Old Testament to the New Testament? It does. It seems like we're dealing with it. In fact, there are some folks back in the early history of the church, they got in trouble for saying those are two different gods, and they tried to drop the Old Testament. It's not, but God doesn't change through all of that, but we do. We're different from the time of Joshua as they were crossing the river into the Promised Land, to the time of Samuel when he was anointing David as king over Israel, from the time of the prophets that were saying it's time to go home, we need to go back to our homeland, to that missing time that we don't have in our Bibles, that where a whole bunch of other events that were taking place, to the time of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, to our time today. Each of those places is different. Each of those people in those places and in those times are different from one to the other, to the other, to the other. God doesn't change, but God does change how he works with us because we're different. But God is faithful. Remember that overarching thing? That we have in Scripture, where God is faithful to us, no matter where we find ourselves, no matter what it is that's going on. God is still there with us, goes there with us, but he knows that we're different, so he's got to change the way that he talks to us, that he interacts with us, that he reaches out to us, so that we'll understand. That's our history. That's the stories that we tell. Those are the things that we are reminded of constantly through that history. But what that means for us in the present going forward is that we know God is still going to be there. That God is going to find us where we are. He's going to talk to us in the ways that we need so that we can understand what it is that he has to say to us in this day. We know that God goes with us. And then that's the message that we can take back to folks. When they say, why does it seem that God is different? It's because we're different. And God is reaching out to us so that we'll understand. And that looks a lot different today than it did even 100 years ago, much less 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. But God is still there. So go this week. Remember the stories. Get a chance to reacquaint yourselves with the stories that are there in the histories of the Old Testament. There are some fascinating things that happen throughout there. If you need a really good place to start, start in 1 Samuel, with the story of Samuel's birth and then his calling to become a judge over Israel. There is a great place where God is quite literally calling out to Samuel to say, go and serve my people. That's a great place to start as you look through the histories. And you look through the stories. And as you follow Samuel's story along, see how God changes the way that he works with Israel as Israel is changing so that he can continue to reach out to them so that they will know who he is. Go, read the stories, share the stories, learn the stories, see where God is at work. And then share that with folks that are around you so that they can begin to see those same stories as they go through their life. Let us go and do this and hear those stories as we go forward, and let us share them in Christ's name. Amen.